Technical Alliance to this webinar, Providing Breastfeeding Counseling During Emergencies. How can we do that? We'll get underway in just a minute. While we wait, I invite you to please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat and also share with us your perspective by answering the question in the chat. What is breastfeeding counseling and what is it not? I can see people are starting to introduce themselves in the chat. So wonderful to see everyone. And please do take a moment while we're waiting for people to join to consider the opening question. Please let us know what your understanding is of breastfeeding counseling in the chat. What is counseling and what is it not? And as we're getting underway now, and the recording has been started, in case you missed my introduction, I'm Jodine Chase, the Infant Feeding and Emergencies Core Group Facilitator. And I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. Can we have the next slide, please? You can access translation services by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen. So please reach out in the chat if you have any difficulties. The Infant Feeding and Emergencies Core Group, on the next slide please, is a global collaboration of agencies and individuals that works to provide policy guidance and training resource gaps, hampering programming on infant and young child feeding in emergencies. We do not directly implement programs. Rather, we develop guidance and resource materials, we document lessons learned, and we build capacity for effective infant and young child feeding support in emergency contexts. We're the global thematic working group on infant and young child feeding in emergencies as part of the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance. These logos on the screen represent our members who are supporting their representatives to do the work to bring this webinar to you today. Next slide, please. Here are our 3 objectives. We want to continue to disseminate the operations guidance for breastfeeding counseling in emergencies, which was released last year, and relevant tools. And we're also going to showcase best practices through 2 case studies, which I will introduce to you later. We also want to document the concerns or questions or issues of field workers. Next slide, please. So here are our 3, oh, pardon me. So here's our agenda. We're going to shortly ask you 2 poll questions to help us understand your familiarity with relevant guidance. And then we'll have a presentation and also our 2 case studies. And following that, there will be a half-hour question and answer. And then we will close with announcements and an evaluation form. Next slide, please. Before we get to the poll, I would like to introduce you to our presenters, our panel members, and I'd also like to acknowledge our facilitators. Isabel is the lead author of the operational guidance that we're presenting today, Breastfeeding Counselling in Emergencies. She worked on this closely with Linda Shacker-Barbari on behalf of the Emergency Nutrition Network and the IFE Core Group. She is an IYCFE specialist with a public health background and almost a decade worth of experience working in diverse humanitarian contexts. Isabel is an IYCFE consultant and also continues to work in private practice as a breastfeeding counselor and postpartum doula from her home in Thailand. Next is Fatmata, the nutrition specialist, infant feeding with UNICEF headquarters. Fatmata manages the breastfeeding portfolio and contributes to UNICEF's global leadership in early childhood nutrition. She has over 15 years of work experience in maternal, infant, and young child nutrition in both emergency and development settings. Next up, and our first case study presenter is Alamayu, known as Alex. Alex is a senior program officer with Goal Ethiopia. He has a BSc in Human Applied Human Neutrino and is presently pursuing an MSc in Project Planning and Management. He has over 12 years of combined work experience at several NGOs in a variety of positions, especially in the areas of health and nutrition. And absolutely last but not least, Ma Innes is the founder of Aragon, a mother support group. Aragon has transformed 50 strong mother support groups in the Philippines who undertake breastfeeding rescue during emergency. Inez is also the founder of the breastfeeding movement in the Philippines in the 80s and is an active leader of IBFAN Southeast Asia. And our facilitators are myself, Alessandro Iliamo from FHI 360, Deborah Wilson from World Food Program Headquarters, Brooke Bauer from the GNC Technical Alliance, and Linda Shacker-Barbari from UNICEF. I will now move to the poll question. I'll just do a check and make sure that we are ready for the poll. Perfect. And so the first question that you will see is asking you which of the documents are you familiar with? The guideline, Counseling of Women to Improve Breastfeeding Practices, the implementation guidance on counseling women to improve breastfeeding practices, or the operations guidance, breastfeeding, counseling, and emergencies from the IFE Core Group, or please choose if you're not familiar with any of the guidance documents. We'll just give you a minute or so to answer the poll questions. I'm seeing the results coming in. We thank you so much for considering and answering these questions. It's so good to see the awareness of these documents, especially our guidance, which was just released at the end of last year. And I see we're reaching just about 70% of participation. I'll ask you to finalize your answers and end the poll. And we'll wrap up that now, I think, when you're ready, Sonia, and move to the next poll question. And the next poll question is, which of these guidance documents have you used? So the first one, the implementation guidance on counseling women to improve breastfeeding practices. And then if you could please let us know if you have used the operations guidance for breastfeeding counseling in emergencies. And thank you again for responding to the poll. We'll just wait a minute while people have a chance to find their way and to click their answers. And it's also wonderful to see you continuing to introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you very much. And I see we have almost 70% of our audience now has filled out the second poll question. We'll just leave it another few seconds, and then we'll close the second poll. Let's go ahead and close that last poll. Thank you very much for participating in our poll today. So we'll move now to the next slide, please. And I'm going to apologize for that bit of noise in the background. I'm going to turn now to Fatmata from UNICEF. Fatmata, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jodine. Colleagues, I can see from the poll that many of you are aware of the document that I'm going to talk about today, the 2018 implementation guidance, as well as the guidance from WHO on counseling women to improve breastfeeding practices. Colleagues, as you may know, this first guidance, which is counseling women to improve breastfeeding practices, was released to help countries to build better breastfeeding programs. And it provides 6 evidence-informed recommendations on breastfeeding counseling. So that guidance really presented a paradigm shift on how we think about breastfeeding counseling. Whereas prior to this document, the focus was on breastfeeding counseling being accessible to women who need it. But this document changed in a way that it provided a strong recommendation for women to access counseling. This includes pregnant and those with young children under 2 years, and to ensure that they have the services of trained counselors. And in terms of counseling, you've all defined counseling in the poll, and as most of you rightly mentioned, the process is an interaction between a counselor and a mother, and it's not a top-down telling approach to the mother about what to do, but it involves problem solving and addressing concerns of mothers about feeding her baby. The fact that we need to do this for all women starting during the period of pregnancy and continuing up to 2 years was a critical element among the recommendations that this guidance provided. And the implementation guidance also says that there should be 6 contacts, and face-to-face contact is recommended. And the guidance also focused on the need to have trained counselors. This may be health professionals, but also paraprofessionals and peer counselors, and the need for them to be trained in counseling. It also involves anticipating and addressing important challenges. So this was the guidance that set the stage for the 2018 implementation guidance that UNICEF and WHO released in 2018 following this guidance. Next slide, please. So in 2021, UNICEF and WHO released a global guidance for implementing the recommendations outlined in the WHO guideline, the counseling of women to improve breastfeeding practices just described earlier in my previous slide. And this program implementation guidance, it really expands on how to implement these 6 recommendations. And the core purpose of this guidance is to ensure that all women receive the high quality breastfeeding counseling recommended in the earlier guidance, through ensuring that the programs are meeting the needs of the mothers at the right times with the appropriately trained staff in sufficient number of contacts and in a manner and mode that is most appropriate for their local context. And this guidance also includes case studies describing good examples of how the key implementation parameters have been implemented in different contexts. Next slide, please. So the implementation guidance, like I mentioned, describe each stage of the breastfeeding counseling program implementation, including how to plan, how to establish, scale, and sustain programs at national and sub-national level. It also guides managers and program planners on how to gather information, establish a planning and coordination team, develop a workforce plan, and establish a planning and coordinating team to develop a workforce plan. It also provides guidance on integration of breastfeeding counseling into emergency preparedness and response plans. So as highlighted here, human resource is a key pillar of this guidance, and it recommends that there is need to plan for adequate human resources by designing a workforce plan that meets the needs of the local population. This includes estimation of expected caseloads and approximating the duration of breastfeeding counseling contacts and planning and hiring key program staff to meet the critical objectives of this guidance. A strong recommendation also includes developing and adapting as well as updating curricula for both pre and in-service training programs. Monitoring and evaluation systems was also a critical element of this guidance because it should aim to benchmark progress using national coverage indicators as well as facility level or community level indicators. It is recommended that regular periodic monitoring and evaluation are important for adjustments to service delivery and updates to any pre-service or in-service training curricula. Then a strong pillar includes ensuring that sustainable financing is secured to ensure that there is early involvement of financial stakeholders for breastfeeding counseling program and integration of breastfeeding counseling into existing healthcare programs to help with sustainability. And the critical element for financial sustainability is to also ensure that funding for breastfeeding counseling is free from conflicts of interest, and that all funding should abide by the International Code of Breast Milk Substitutes and the subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions. And the last but important part of advocacy is ensuring that breastfeeding counseling gains the stakeholder buy-in and supportive policies are established to ensure that the national development strategies, the national nutrition policies and action plans are also established and integrated into breastfeeding counseling programs. Then lastly, but finally, not least, it's important to ensure that breastfeeding counseling integrates emergency preparedness and response. Program planners should prepare for counseling in emergencies by including this in national emergency preparedness and response plans. As we know, this is a critical element in emergencies to ensure that infants and young children are protected and to help them to survive and thrive. So this guidance includes details on preparing for counseling in emergencies, and these details will follow shortly in a presentation that Isabel would outline to all of you. And thank you all colleagues for listening.
Thank you so much, Fatmata. Isabel, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And I am going to present to you the operational guidance on breastfeeding counselling in emergencies. So on behalf of the IFE core group, it is really a pleasure to present this document to you, because we know that in emergencies, skilled breastfeeding counselling does save lives. And despite the fact that we often hear that it's really difficult to establish breastfeeding counselling services in emergencies, our shared experiences have shown us that, in fact, it is possible to establish or to re-establish breastfeeding counselling services, and subsequently to improve and protect breastfeeding practices, even in the midst of a crisis. And this guidance tells you just how to do that. So as already mentioned by Jodine, this guidance was co-authored with Dr. Linda Shaker-Barbari, who's also with us today, and with whom I conducted desk reviews and practitioner interviews and collected case studies which informed this guidance. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging the really valuable guidance which was also offered by IFE core group members, and especially the practitioners with experience and expertise in delivering breastfeeding counselling during emergencies around the world, who contributed their time to be interviewed to inform this guidance. And we're so grateful to all of them, because it helped to ensure that this guidance is really based on lived experiences and on global expertise. So today I'm going to take around 15 minutes to briefly discuss why this guidance was developed, and then we'll take a closer look at how you can use this guidance to help you to prepare and to plan, design and implement breastfeeding counselling programs, even in really tricky emergency contexts. Next slide, please. So as you arrived, we asked you, what is counselling? And the reason for this is that it's very common for there to be different understandings of what we mean when we say breastfeeding counselling. So I just wanted to take a brief moment to make sure that we're all on the same page. I didn't see so many answers coming in, so I will just share a few key points on it. I did see someone mention that breastfeeding counselling is a two-way interaction. That's absolutely correct. Between a trained breastfeeding counsellor and one or more pregnant women, mothers or other caregivers of children who are most typically under 2 years of age, although of course we also have older babies who continue to breastfeed. So in the top photo here, the top right, we can see group counselling, and that is also considered breastfeeding counselling. But that really depends on the facilitation style. So is there this listening and learning? And are the participants interacting and engaging? So if it's simply a sort of lecture or a classroom style session, then we should be reporting that as breastfeeding education. That's not counselling. So the process really involves listening to concerns and discussing questions, teaching about breastfeeding, and observing and assisting with the normal process of breastfeeding, and as well as breastfeeding challenges that may arise. And it is different to basic breastfeeding education or sensitization or the sharing of key or generic messages. Sometimes when we see huge numbers of women counseled being reported, thousands and thousands, it's actually messaging that's taking place. So the key difference to look for is these listening and learning and skills building interactions that take place during counseling that support a caregiver in their own decision-making process. And the aim of this is really to empower women to breastfeed and to strengthen responsive caregiving practices, while also respecting their personal situations and wishes. Now, in the bottom right corner, we see a baby being cup fed. So caregivers may transition between artificial feeding and breastfeeding, or they may be mixed feeding, so doing both. So counselling to reduce the risks of artificial feeding and to ensure that it's carried out in a hygienic and responsive manner should really not be seen as separate from breastfeeding counselling, and adequate support should be provided for both breastfed and non-breastfed children as part of an emergency response. So breastfeeding counselling includes support for relactation, cup feeding, increasing milk supply, which is which are all actions which might be carried out with babies who are breastfed or fully or partially artificially fed. So sometimes instead of breastfeeding counselling, it's also common for us to refer to IYCF counselling. And this really describes comprehensive counselling that includes breastfeeding counselling, but also, if applicable and needed, counselling on complementary feeding and artificial feeding. So if you would like to understand more about this, the first section of the operational guidance, the breastfeeding counselling is the title, I think, discusses a bit more what breastfeeding counselling is, what it is not, and then also some of the entry points for breastfeeding counselling during emergencies. Next slide, please. So I would like to ask you all a question here. During an emergency, what challenges may caregivers face in feeding their infants and young children as recommended? And if you like, we can really focus in on breastfeeding for the purposes of this. So I'll just give you a minute to put your answers in the chat box, please. And I'll continue talking a little bit while you do that. So feel free to think of an emergency context that you've experienced or that you're currently working in. And I've also put some photos up just to give you some additional ideas of challenges that breastfeeding women around the world who are living in and experiencing emergencies may be facing. So, for example, in the bottom left photo, we see a baby who lost their mother to Ebola in Liberia. So the person who is going to become the primary caregiver of this maternal orphan is likely going to need IYCF counselling, and for example, counselling on artificial feeding. And also during infectious disease outbreaks, it's very common for us to see concerns about the transmission of a communicable disease. So we really need to build back up confidence, provide accurate information, and these sorts of things. So perhaps you can also think of some other challenges that caregivers may face during infectious disease outbreaks or any other type of emergency. Let's see. Indiscriminate distribution of formula by first responders. Yes, absolutely. This is a very big challenge that can really knock mothers' confidence. Separation, absolutely. So we see that in the picture of the baby being pulled out of the rubble in Syria. Separation often increases during emergencies. Split from their support system, exactly. So very much harder to access support. A calm place to breastfeed, so important, and often very much missing because of lack of privacy, overcrowding. Maternal death, yep. Wow, lots of ideas here. I'm seeing mental health. Lots of, yes, hygiene. Restricted access to a kitchen for hygienic preparation of formula milk, and that can also apply to complementary feeding. So thank you all so much for all these contributions. And the operational guidance contains a very comprehensive table which covers many of these challenges that caregivers may face at different levels, for example, individual or household. And then it also goes into what might be the implications of this challenge, both for breastfeeding support and for breastfeeding itself. So you covered most of them already. So if you're interested, you can take a look at all the detail provided in the OPS guidance. I think one that I didn't see that's in there is increased levels of environmental toxins. So for example, floodwaters or radioactive contamination, which was a concern that was recently raised for the Ukraine crisis. So again, urgent counselling is needed to support these caregivers and their valid concerns. So in addition to preparing families for the sort of normal and expected infant development and behaviors and key milestones that happen all over the world, for example, introducing a baby to their first complementary food, during emergencies, anticipatory guidance also refers to anticipating and addressing challenges which are related to IYCF specific to this emergency context. So by understanding really the specific context, and therefore the threats that might be present and the challenges that caregivers may face. And by anticipating how these threats might undermine or complicate breastfeeding for breastfeeding women, counselors can really help to reduce the potential risks and problems by anticipating them and being aware of them. So this was an important point why this guidance was developed, was there are really some unique challenges during emergencies. Next slide, please. So lastly, my last slide on why this guidance was developed, and I won't spend long on this because I think if you're already here, it's very likely that you're already aware of the life-saving importance of breastfeeding, and especially during emergencies, this is true. But we see that really when it's needed the most, good breastfeeding practices are often eroded and undermined by many of the factors that you just mentioned. And all of us know how common it is for a new parent to worry about feeding or caring for their new baby. And these concerns only become bigger in emergencies, and understandably so. So all of this means that breastfeeding mothers really need urgent reassurance and skilled support so that they can continue to nurture and to nourish and to protect their babies. And this is one of the reasons that breastfeeding counselling is listed as a priority action in the Sphere Handbook. And we know that breastfeeding counselling can make a very important difference during emergencies. At the same time, there are really unique challenges to delivering these breastfeeding counselling programs as per the WHO guideline recommendations, which Fatmata just mentioned. And this is why this specific guidance was developed that really focuses on emergencies. Next slide, please. So here is just a very quick reminder of the recommendations from the WHO guideline, which Fatmata already went over with you, and which are also covered in detail for non-emergency context in the implementation guidance. Now, I'd like you to consider how can we implement these recommendations in an emergency? Is it realistic? Is it feasible? Is it really possible that we reach 100% of mothers when there are hundreds of thousands of people who've been affected? And how can we counsel at least 6 times when people affected by an emergency are constantly changing location, for example, to escape violence? And what other competencies does a counsellor need to have when they're working with a caregiver who is distressed, who's traumatized, or when bottle feeding has suddenly become much more dangerous than it was before the emergency? And should we continue to follow this recommendation to provide face-to-face counselling, even if there's an infectious disease outbreak? So these are all tricky questions to think through when we're busy practitioners working in the middle of an emergency. So I would like to ask you to reflect, to share with us in the box, what is your biggest challenge when delivering breastfeeding counselling in emergencies? What is really the tricky part? What are the barriers for you? And more specifically, what are the challenges with implementing some of these recommendations, and how feasible are they? So I would invite you just to take a minute to reflect individually on every single recommendation. Perhaps if you have a pen and paper, you would like to take some notes, sort of maybe a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not feasible at all and 5 is totally feasible. It's easy for me to do. This is just for yourself, a small exercise. We won't be sharing, but let's take a moment to reflect. Yeah, I'm seeing you also sharing some challenges. Stress in health workers absolutely is a big one. Priorities of health situation. Yes, often counselling is not prioritized when we need to focus on curative services. Okay, Thank you all so much. So you have probably identified some or many of these recommendations which are difficult, or they may seem impossible even to implement in an emergency. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And the OPS guidance tells us what we can do instead. So let's take a look at that now. Next slide, please. So in the second section of the guidance, providing breastfeeding counselling in emergencies, it covers the application of each of these recommendations in an emergency setting, including who we should prioritise, how, when, how often. So for each recommendation, we go over the challenges and solutions that you might face. And then there are some possible solutions presented. And then if we can't find any solutions, then there are some adaptations and compromises as well. So this document really goes into detail for each of these and presents some other options. Now, just because it's an emergency is not an excuse for us not to try to reach the recommendations. However, we recognize that sometimes it is really, really hard, and breastfeeding counseling continues to be very valuable and life-saving. And so there are these possible adaptations to consider. Next slide, please. And then the third section of the guidance is on counselling capacity in emergencies. And this provides guidance on the recommendation on who can provide counselling and how we can operationalise these counselling services through making sure adequate capacity is in place. And healthcare professionals, paraprofessionals, such as peer counsellors, and also other breastfeeding supporters all have such an important role to play. And to ensure continuity of care across all these providers, we want to equip them with a consensus-driven set of core counselling competencies, so certain knowledge and skills. And this is a set that we can agree, for example, with the nutrition cluster. And we use information from the needs assessments and anything else that we have to focus on what are the really essential counselling skills and knowledge needed to address the most urgent needs of an emergency affected population. And when we're working in resource-limited settings, we really need to focus on equipping counsellors with the competencies that are required for simple, effective, low-cost, and low-technology interventions. So, for example, listening and reassurance, skin-to-skin contact, hand expression, cup feeding. And so that we can support the greatest number of dyads, we really want to aim to address the most common suboptimal practices that are carrying the greatest risks, the most widespread problems and caregiver concerns, and the most prevalent beliefs that may be relevant to address during counselling. Also in emergencies, it's likely that counsellors are likely to need additional competencies so that they can provide appropriate support and fully meet the needs of the emergency affected population. So for example, in some emergencies, we might need to train counsellors how to help a mother to breastfeed during infectious disease outbreaks. And the operational guidance provides a comprehensive list of these competencies for you to consider for each unique emergency. And we can come up with this set through a process listed below of capacity assessment and mapping, followed by capacity building and planning. And the process for that is also described in the operational guidance. I don't want to scare counsellors working in non-emergency settings off with this information. It is so important that we remember that also counsellors working in non-emergencies already know what to do. They may just require a quick orientation. Things like listening and reassurance, which is really just a basic counselling skill, is one of the most important and powerful things that we can offer in an emergency. It's great practice to actually practice in a non-emergency context as part of preparedness. So how can we use our observational skills instead of depending on equipment and technology like scales? Can we keep up our hand expression skills? Stress management. We often think of that only for emergencies, but actually stress comes up for new mothers in everyday life all around the world. So how can we be teaching caregivers also in non-emergency settings to focus and to connect and to relax with their babies? This will increase their resilience. And likewise, I think someone mentioned stress in counselors themselves. So how can we prepare them as well to manage this better? Okay, last slide, please. So this is just to explain how to use these two documents together. The operational guidance is framed according to the implementation guidance for non-emergency settings. And these two documents were developed around the same time and in close coordination with each other. So the ops guidance is considered an addendum to the implementation guidance, but you can also use it as a separate document. And guidance which is applicable to emergency and non-emergency settings, you will find in the red document on the left-hand side. So in the operational guidance, we're not repeating this content, but rather we're really focusing on what else is it that you need to know, what might you need to do differently if you're planning to provide breastfeeding counseling during a crisis. So please refer to the implementation guidance for guidance which applies to both settings, as well as further considerations on advocacy and policy, service planning, coordination, leadership, M&E, and emergency preparedness. And please refer to the operational guidance to really get ready to prepare and deliver breastfeeding counseling during an emergency. So with this, I hope that you feel a little bit more confident in how to use this document to plan and deliver a counseling program which is effective at protecting and supporting breastfeeding and ultimately at saving lives during an emergency. So thank you so much. That's it from me. Over to you, Jodine.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel. That was a terrific presentation. So we're now going to turn over to our colleagues who have been implementing breastfeeding counseling in emergencies programming. And while we're preparing for the next two sessions, please do consider posting your questions in the Q&A. Anything that you can think of as they come up, and we'll have a good Q&A session toward the end. Now, because of connectivity problems, Alex has pre-recorded this presentation. We'll be bringing that up for you now. And while we're transitioning, I'll just take a moment to let you know that Goal Ethiopia does use various ways of engaging families to elicit improved MIYCF practices that are outlined. This presentation is going to focus largely on a modality that has been shown to have the greatest impact to date, and I will leave you now to learn more about it. Go ahead, please.
Can you see that, Jodine?
Yes, we can see that, Ben.
Great.
Hello everyone, this is Alemayo from Ethiopia, working with Goal as a senior program officer. Especially I've been involving on the areas of mommy activity in Gambela refugee camp. So now I'm going to present you maternal breastfeeding knowledge and practice and educational video, the importance of educational video in Ethiopia Gambela refugee camp. Our goal visions are goal beliefs in a world where poverty no longer exists, where vulnerable communities are resilient, where barriers to well-being are removed, and where everyone has equal rights and opportunities. Now I'm going to present you the background of the Gambela refugee camps. Ethiopia is one of the third largest refugee hosting country in Africa. There are 7 refugee camps in the region. Out of these, 5 of them are host in the largest number of refugees in Ethiopia. As of August 2021, Gambela was hosting 377,792 South Sudanese refugees are living in the Gambela region. Types of MIYCF counseling provided. Individual MIYCF counseling provided one-to-one for any carer enrolled in mommy or stabilization center or SSC OTP service in the program for all beneficiaries. Community outreach agents are providing group and individual MIYSF counseling through active case finding of family, either with their family members or as a group. Mother to mother and father to father support group were established at the camp level and supporting the activity at the community level as well as the nutrition center level for optimal IYSF and MIYSF practices. Groups of MIYSF counseling provided for all women, for pregnant and lactating mothers with mother also at the age of 5-year children. Global health media translated breastfeeding videos are used as part of the activity, which is really important and chosen by the mother to easily understand and capture what they are watched from the video. Operational research, we have been trying to translate different global health media, which is really important and valuable to improve the quality of service and the activity which is delivered especially in IYSF and the MIYSF program to improve the quality of this breastfeeding activity in the refugee camp, which is really important and most of the time which was preferred by the mother. There was an assessment which was conducted by GOL, Ethiopia Gambia team, to identify the gaps and the needs of on the MIYSF and IYSF activity area in the refugee camp, especially during the emergency phase. The study was the study flow was program, NAMI program and MIYSF pre-assessment mothers with infant age of 0 to 4 months, which was conducted from August to October 2020. It has also primary outcome and secondary outcome. Among the primary outcome was exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, bottle feeding, cup feeding, knowledge of early initiation of breastfeeding after delivery, knowledge of complementary feeding program after the age of 6 months. Among the secondary outcome, advantage of early initiation of breastfeeding after delivery, attachment and positioning of breastfeeding, signs that baby is hungry and crying during hunger, intervention area, educational video plus standard cares, which was included also utility, appropriateness, acceptability, effectiveness, challenges, and suggestions. The study was also include post-assessments of the activity, especially after the beneficiary was discharged from the program after 2 months. It was conducted October to December 2020. Summary and way forward. Both mothers and the health worker found the video acceptable, useful, and effective to improve and increase the service which is provided for the beneficiary, especially for pregnant and lactating mother in the refugee camps. We found after watching the video, exclusive breastfeeding was sustained, but crucially, there were considerable improvement in more detailed maternal breastfeeding understanding and knowledge. Since the mother was able to watch the video, which is really important and increase understandings of the mother and memory of the mother. Video enables mothers to physically practice positive practice whilst watching or not usually achieved through practice counselings. Mothers had improved engagement and most importantly of all, improved memory of retention. Once the mother are watched the video, they are able to memorize what they have watched from the video, and they are also trying to practically implement what they are watched from the video. Video result in a reduced workload for healthcare workers in the nutrition sector also. Once the mothers are watched the video, they are trying to practice what they have been watched from the video in, which is really important to increase the workload for health workers in the IYCF and nutrition center. Future plan, implement this video, assist counseling in both MIYCF and MAMI program in the refugee setup. Consider increased frequency, screen size or bigger. Invite other family member to engage on this video counseling or at the MIYCF and MAMI program level. This is all about our presentation from our side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to hear from Ma Ines, also a recording to support the need for technical problems connecting. Both Alex and Ma Ines are available to us and will be here during the question and answer. But Ben is just queuing up the recording now. Go ahead, Ben, when you're ready. I can see your screen.
Hey to everyone involved in humanitarian service, especially in IFE, and those attending this webinar on providing breastfeeding counseling during emergency. How can we do that? Greetings from Manila. I am Ines Fernandez from Philippines, and my organization, a mother support group called Arugaan, meaning to nurture fully with lifetime commitment. We have the Arugaan Best Team, breastfeeding experts, support team of seasoned breastfeeding counselor trainers who are experts in lactation management. 50 of us are ever ready anytime and anywhere where emergency arises. Part of the breastfeeding rescue is the SRA, simple, rapid assessment tool that WHO gave us to oversee the coverage of the 6,410 survivors of the most cruel typhoon in the world that devastated the lives, limbs, and livelihood of the Filipinos in the two big islands years ago. This experience became the gold standard protocol whenever we are on breastfeeding rescue during calamities and crises. Step 1. Bring all moms with babies, including pregnant women and grandmas, for breastfeeding empowerment in one evacuation tent. The show and tell is the most effective in demonstrating learning for moms. Remember, the survivors of the typhoons are half attentive and the minds are worrying of what will happen to them as their loved ones are missing and they lost their homes. Step 2. Ask permission from 2 women for the lactation process where the formula milk feeding baby will be wet nursed by a breastfeeding mom in twin positioning, as you can see on the slide. Step 3. The bottle feeding baby for the first time will have her first breastfeeding experience. Thereafter, step 4, put the baby back on her mom to breastfeed and apply the drip drop of the donor's breast milk while her baby continued to breastfeed on her. And that is only during transitional period. But most of all, most important, is to ensure that they share their learnings in their community as a shared social responsibility. And most critical is to involve the community-based health workers because they are the ones who will be visiting their homes and to come up with the same standard messages in counseling. Thus, we set up a cluster counseling, especially for community-based health workers, as you see on the middle of the slide. Another most efficient intervention is the fast-track mother-to-mother support in 2-hour duration only. 5 women helping each other. The breastfeeding counselor guides the mom who wish to be relactated, the mom in red blouse on the slide. Another mom lend her baby to breastfeed on the mom being relactated, while this other mom is expressing her breast milk for the drip drop application. And another mom wet nurse the formula fed baby so that the baby will experience her first breastfeeding initiation, while another woman handles the baby of the wet nurse as a support. And step 5, put the baby to her biological mom for breastfeeding while on drip drop of donor's breast milk. Tandem to breastfeeding response is the complementary feeding for babies above 6 months of age and toddlers. Healthy food is most needed by the starving survivors of the typhoon. For a month long, they were on canned goods and ultra-processed foods inimical to their health. Another problematic is the influx of donated formula milk and complementary foods products, and these are in the guise of charity under predatory marketing by the milk companies and baby food industry and using front organizations at the evacuation center. Traditional food literacy seminars is provided for the community and they are involved in community cooking. We are mindful of the special needs of the babies and toddlers who need frequent feeding intervals and food availability that is appropriate to their tiny stomachs. These vulnerable babies get hungry often, and the interactive feeding under ECCD, Early Child Care and Development, must be applied. Thus, the moms need food containers for complementary feeding, and traditional food indigenous to one's culture, tropical climate, and country must be the principle in complementary feeding. Recently, the Aruga and Best team went on a trek to provide trainings for 100 breastfeeding counselors and skills transfer of the power of lactation massage as an intervention. The province of Camarines Sur registered as one of the highest malnutrition of children on formula milk feeding. This province is always stricken by most of the 27 typhoons that ravages the Philippines yearly, and in between volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and floods, and internal conflicts in isolated parts. In this slide, we'll show you the trainees on their back, and they are taught the full body lactation massage with 53 techniques, and it is the most powerful in the relactation process by recapturing back breastfeeding for women as the nurturers of the next generation. The first step is to comfort the back that carries the woman's body. The purpose is to relax the tired muscles that carry her pregnancy and now the baby. There are many lactation points to stimulate the flow of breast milk, Even the feet and the hands have corresponding lactation points. The second step is to massage the head to cushion the anxious mind, to command the release of the prolactin hormone that makes the milk. Likewise, the relaxing massage also builds confidence on the women. And the third step is the final act. The sensitive breast and areola has special massage that aids engorgement and the flow of the breastfeeding hormones. Indeed, a transformative impact. Give me a mom with a baby on formula milk feeding, and I assure you, we will be able to recapture back the power of breastfeeding. And for babies above 6 months, it takes a while, but definitely we will be able to bring back lactation and breastfeeding. Yes, grandma can breastfeed. Age does not matter in lactation power. I am a living testimony to have wet nursed a 2-year-old toddler for 2 months. And that is me on the last photo of this slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful image to end with. So now I'm going to turn things over to Brooke and to Linda, who are going to facilitate our Q&A section. Go ahead, please.
Great, thank you very much. Go ahead, Brooke. Go ahead, Linda. Great, thank you everyone for the fantastic presentations and the interesting questions that we've received so far in the Q&A. The first one that we can start with is on breastfeeding counseling and the definition. Bindi asks that we didn't mention the support for wet nursing or shared nursing, and is there a reason for that? And I'm wondering if Isabel, you might be able to answer that question.
Hi, Bindi. That was really just for the purposes of brevity. But of course, counseling a woman who's a wet nurse would also be part of counseling. There are so many different things that are listed in the competencies. We couldn't cover them all, but thank you for flagging it because it is a really important competency, and you'll find it listed in the recommended list of competencies, especially for emergencies. So thank you.
Thank you, Isabel, for that. Really important. And I think the last presentation also showed that aspect. We do have another question that is specific to trauma-informed counseling, which I believe, Isabel, you had mentioned. And a question from Lukman asking whether it means that we have to address the trauma, and if yes, then how about the trauma that can possibly lead to inconvenience for the mother or caregiver during a counseling session? Are you happy to take that on, Isabel?
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually really happy that this question has been asked because it's something that we really need to be talking about more. And recently there's been work going on to understand a little bit more what that might look like in an emergency. So I have a little bit of a long answer for you, because there were also several questions included in that question. So to avoid doing harm and to really be providing effective care and also improving access to services. So we want mothers to feel comfortable coming to the services rather than fearful. It's very important that breastfeeding counselling programs, especially those who are serving populations who have had high levels of exposure to trauma, are applying a trauma-informed approach. So if you look at the operational guidance, we have a glossary at the back, and there we have defined trauma-informed care. I'm just going to read it out to you. As a framework that guides counsellors' support of caregivers in a way that is sensitive to trauma's ongoing impact, and seeks to avoid activating post-traumatic responses. So that means triggering someone, causing flashbacks because of maybe a sound or a word that we use, or causing new or additional trauma. So for the first one, being sensitive to trauma's ongoing impact in a person's life, an example of that might be that we better understand how sexual violence can impact a mother's breastfeeding experience. It can be very healing and it can be very difficult, or how it might impact her behavior towards a counselor. So sometimes we get frustrated because a mother appears not to be able to retain the information we're sharing, or she might appear rude or aggressive. And it's important to understand that those behaviors are because her nervous system is in fight mode. So she's having a trauma response. And if a counselor understands these reactions, then it's much easier to respond with care and with compassion rather than getting frustrated or offended. Now, I just want to be very clear that this really does not mean that breastfeeding counselors should diagnose or treat trauma. They are not mental health professionals. Instead, trauma-informed care is referring to the fact that all counselors should be trained to provide basic trauma-informed care to all counseling clients. So we are working on the assumption that anyone may have experienced trauma. So maybe it's helpful to think about this as a universal precaution. So the same way, for example, that a nurse might use gloves during certain medical procedures, we should also use universal precautions for all our counseling clients. So this means I don't need to know a mother's story to be trauma-informed. Sometimes asking what happened to someone can bring up a lot of unpleasant feelings and memories, which we might then be not equipped to support her with if we're not adequately trained. So I also don't need her to tell me her whole history. And I don't need to diagnose this mother is traumatized, this mother is not traumatized. And actually, I'm not qualified to do that. But instead, I can apply this universal trauma-informed care to everybody. So, for example, with every single counseling client that I see, I want to be asking for permission, for consent, and if I need to touch her, for example, to examine her breast. And I'll be explaining why this touch is necessary. Because I'm aware that if she does happen to be a survivor of sexual violence, it can be extremely distressing to suddenly be touched. Or I might even try not to touch her at all, but instead use hands-off counseling as much as possible. So using a doll, using verbal instructions instead. So if we just treat every single counseling client in this way, it actually just means that we're providing really good care to everyone. I hope that answers your question. If you have any more, please ask. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Isabel. Our next question we have is for Alex with GOAL. The question is, how can we set up breastfeeding counseling when there are no trained practitioners? And what are some practical recommendations? Alex, are you able to? There were some technical difficulties earlier, so we might hold off on that and see if we can be in touch with Alex. The next question was for, or if Hattie is on goal as well.
Yeah, what I can do, I'll just put the question to Alex and see if he wants to come back to me with anything. So if you loop back to that.
Happily. Great, we'll do. Linda, do you want to take the next one for?
Yes, sure. And also, there was a question for Aragon about how can we help communities prepare and build their capacity so that they can respond immediately. And of course, they've shared their experience, but any quick tips to help communities do that? Ines, this is yours.
Quick tips. Quick fix.
Tips.
I beg your pardon. Please repeat slowly.
So a question around how can we help communities prepare and to have their capacities built so that they're able to respond rather immediately or faster during an emergency? It is a rather large question, but maybe if you can share a few quick lessons learned or tips from your experience.
Okay, thank you for that question. Now that there is no emergency, it is now the timeliness of breastfeeding preparedness and response. That's why we go from town to town now to form mother support group. And during that training, as much as possible, we bring almost everyone there. So we will have direct participants that we guide, and then there will be observers. Because for all you know, maybe half of the observers will be active during emergency. And the most important is when they see a demonstration, they can see how it is done step by step. And that is, it registers in their memory, it imprints in their memory. And when crisis come, they remember that, or even their neighbors who tag along or their friends whom they will meet in the evacuation center will be helping each other piece together the steps. So now is the time to prioritize and train. So it does not entail a lot of resources, meaning financial, it is a key, but it is not end all, because in the community itself, there are many resources.
Absolutely. And I think what you're highlighting really is that sentence that we always use, that the best emergency preparedness is really a breastfeeding community, a community that is used to supporting and used to breastfeeding and used to providing this community support. So thank you so much for that.
It's sustainable.
Exactly.
Fantastic. And you have Lourdes in the chat greeting with you, community training during times of stability. And then they're the first responders during emergencies. So well said. There's a lot of agreement with you there. Another question for you in the Q&A is you spoke about grandmothers breastfeeding as well. And is there an age or any parameters? Up to what age can we confidently say this in the Q&A? Can you explain a little bit more about it?
During calamities, crisis, you don't think of age. Everyone has the boobs. You just have to activate, it's there. The resource is enormous and it is there. So it's a matter of convincing, persuading, and then showing. So age is not a consideration in relactation management, but we should be there from the beginning till the end. The grandma is, in fact, many of the grandmas in the evacuation center are eager, because what happened to us during the turbulent typhoons, the moms were missing, especially the pregnant moms. They were washed away by the tidal waves. And what was left with the orphans were the grandma. So it is incumbent for us to really do the fast track management reviving lactation in grandmas. That is the only resource we have. And it is the most effective and reasonable.
Great, thank you so much. I'll hand it back over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Brooke. There are a couple of questions that are also technical in relation to your experience, Ines. So if there's a lot of interest around learning how to create these groups and the breastfeeding support, so wondering if you could share maybe a link or some additional resources about your experience. I can see Camila Bravo asking about that, to know how to activate these groups and how long does it take. So it would be great if you could share some of the resources. And there is one last technical question also that is about specific supplementary feeding techniques, and rather than spoon drip techniques, so very much lactation consultant question. I don't know if you want to reflect on that, or anyone else from your colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you for the interest. We can do webinars and we teach step by step. In Indonesia, they ask us to be there and we teach the health practitioners. And good news, I'm going to US. For those who would want a hands-on, I will be there from November 11 to January 15. So for those who are near, we can share the skills. So we can do it in many ways. So it takes only 2 days of intensive training. That already covers the practicum. Thank you.
Thank you. Brooke, over to you. I think there's also another question.
Sure. Isabel, I'm going to come to you with this question, a little bit more about relactation. There's kind of 2 questions in there about different techniques, so supplementary feeding techniques rather than spoon drip techniques, and how long does it take, how does it activate, etc. Is there anything that you would like, or Fatmata would like to touch on with regards to guidance for relactation?
Yes, I'm happy to share a few thoughts. So there are a number of different methods out there. Specifically, the supplementary feeding requires pretty good hygiene because we have those very small rubber tubes. So this is often not preferred in an emergency situation. For example, if a mother might be doing that at home. So in that case, drip drop is a very effective technique and a safer one. So there are a number of different considerations. In terms of how long it takes, that really depends on the individual, whether we're really, how long she hasn't breastfed for, lots of different factors, more than I can go into now. And what was the last one, Brooke? There was a third. Sort of how does it work? Through stimulation. So the more we put the baby to the breast, the quicker milk production will start back up. So very frequent breastfeeding if the baby's latching, frequent milk expression. We really want to get that milk flowing, and lots of skin to skin contact. So yeah, I hope that answers questions, and I'm sure there are colleagues who can add more. I know Ines is really an expert in this, so perhaps someone wants to compliment. Thank you.
I was going to hand over and ask Ines about, I think you use a lot of massage as well. Is that right?
Yes. The power of lactation massage is the final touch on relactation for a fast track. We can do that. And even the trainees who are attending, whose children, the youngest is 21 years old, we were able to relactate, without any intention to relactate, but we are able to stimulate the lactation points in their bodies. But of course, it really comes from the psychological makeup, especially those who are already into breastfeeding training or seminar. there is already a preparedness. But even then, in our experience during emergency, the grandmas, because I think the breastfeeding hormones are aligned during emergency. And given a very short period of time, like an hour, we can do that. It needs a skill. And it needs a lot of comfort words, comfort touch, but most of all, we have also to give them comfort food in times of crisis. Food is most important. When we go on breastfeeding rescue, tandem with our counseling is the food provision.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And Linda, I think Hattie came back with the question about counseling, how to set up breastfeeding counseling when there's no trained counselors. So if that's okay, Linda, I'll hand it over to Hattie now.
Yeah, thanks. I was waiting for our team. Have got very poor electricity supply, so they're working off the dongle at the moment. Yeah, in summary, I mean, the first thing I would do, because you obviously want, if there's a need for it, you want to establish it. So I would probably use the implementation guidance on counselling women to improve breastfeeding practices. And that guidance, you know, it's great because it walks you through all the steps. So it talks about, you know, how to, information you need to gather on the target audience, the you know, beneficiaries that you're working with, how to plan for service delivery, appropriate training, appropriate monitoring. It's also, you know, if you're lacking experience in that sort of context, I would also advise using things like the global health media videos, where they're divided into using, videos for using with health professionals, and then also with the primary caregivers themselves. But they're a really, really fantastic resource because they show so much more than we can ever give through just didactic style training. And the Goal Ethiopia group came back and said, you know, in the interim, whilst you're setting all that up, because that takes a little bit of time to get going, that they would probably start with initiating community support groups, mother-to-mother support groups, father support groups, community groups, whatever forums you can are most appropriate and you can establish, because they are great forums just for sharing and knowledge sharing right from the get-go. So that could be something you could do as a sort of immediate response whilst you set up the training and establishment of actually trained counsellors. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Hattie. Linda, over.
Thank you. There is another question that has been posted, very specific from Bindi, asking about breast surgery, and be glad to see the history of breast surgery mentioned in the risk groups, and whether there are particular settings where you've seen this, potentially in high-income countries. So I believe maybe question for colleagues, Isabel, Fatmata, Ines, whoever would like to jump in.
Perhaps I can start by explaining why we included it in the guidance, and then it would be great to hear the experience of others. So in short, this wasn't mentioned by practitioners specifically when we interviewed them. However, we just looked to the evidence base from non-emergency contexts. We know that a history of breast surgery is often, can be a risk factor for breastfeeding difficulties, and therefore it's good to know about this and to prioritize these mothers for breastfeeding support in emergencies. But we didn't come across any specific examples, so it would be great to hear if other colleagues have experienced this. Thank you.
Ines or others? Yes.
Yeah, during emergency, all status, class status, economic status, they all are the same. They became survivors. And there are those we encounter. When it comes to medical aspect, we refer. So hand in hand with a medical expert and the trained breastfeeding counselor, because sometimes the medical doctors are not also into practice in breastfeeding counseling. So it becomes a tandem helping each other. And in fact, the doctor learned from the breastfeeding counselor. and also see at firsthand how it is done. So we have encountered those who had reduction, those who have implant, and for others, it does not affect. But maybe it depends on how well, in our experience, we have encountered during at the evacuation center, but very isolated, and we are able to bring back lactation. That is our experience.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think Brooke and I will hand over back to Jodine. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. What an absolutely fascinating question and answer session. I appreciate everyone's contributions and especially the efforts made to connect with our colleague in Ethiopia through their connection difficulties. So we're very close to wrapping up now, and I am going to turn our closing over to Alex. If you could please, Ben, slip to the next slide. These are some additional tools and resources to draw to your attention. We have our infographics, which can assist with implementation. Save the Children has a remote IYCF remote counseling online course. Of course, the guidance itself, the IYCFE Hub, which is a portal which has many resources available. And also, if you would like to continue this discussion and have further questions, please head over to NNet, which is our Emergency Nutrition Network's moderated forum for questions and answers. So I'm going to turn this over to you now, Alex, to close, and I will put the links to these resources in our chat. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you, Jodine, and thank you to all the speakers. And if I may, a really special thanks to Ademayo, Beth, and our colleagues from Arugan, Ines, and the team and the Gold team. Sorry. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide, just to a quick reminder, also in the interest of time, as you all know, this is an effort, a partnership between the IFE Core Group and the Global Nutrition Cluster Technical Alliance. So please be reminded that you can reach out and request for support in relation to infant feeding in emergency, but also other aspects of nutrition in emergency. So, and this is how you can reach into the website, the link, and request support and specify the type of support. So again, it's not just for IFE, but in relation to any NIE. Next, please. I think it's also important to acknowledge the donors that are supporting the Cluster Technical Alliance, the GNC Technical Alliance, the IFE Core Group, that are making these efforts possible, the translation, the interpretation, and the people working behind the scenes to ensure that the platforms are up and running. Next, please. And I also want to mention, as a member of the webinar group, and first also, sorry, I forgot, I really wanted to thank the members of the webinar committee. Some of them have been actively engaged in this webinar, like Linda, like Brooke, like Jodine, of course, and then there are others behind the scenes. And I may not mention all the names just because I forgot them, but we have people like Deborah, people like Sanja, people like Brigitte from ACF. So again, thank you for ensuring and contributing to the success of this webinar. And again, also Fatmata from UNICEF, for example. There will be a new webinar, so stay tuned. Another exciting one with more experiences from the field, and maybe one will be yours, the one that you are listening, one of you that are listening today. So wait for the announcements. And the last slide, if I'm not mistaken, is just to ask you a favor. Webinars can be improved if you share your thoughts and suggestions. Webinar can be made even more exciting if you share your thoughts and suggestions. So as soon as we close, you will receive a pop-up that will ask you to connect to a link, and access the link and provide your answer. So please do share, provide your inputs, insights, ideas, and we will be certainly listening to it. So again, Jodine and the team, thank you so much. And I think the next slide is just a big thank you. Over to you, Jodine.
Thank you so very much, Alex. Yes, we very much appreciate your input in the evaluation. I will leave it to Sonia now to pop up the evaluation questionnaire. And thank you all very much for coming. And thank you so much, especially to our participants. We'll see you again in our next webinar in November. Bye-bye for now.